I've decided in this presentation to synthesize several presentations that I've given in the past. So if I go very quickly on specific points. So if you are interested in knowing more about some of the issues that I'm tackling, I have three forthcoming papers on most of what I'm going to say. So basically, I'm going to look at hallucinations, but by studying hallucinogens and hallucinogenic experiences. And it's quite striking that very often when psychologists, neuroscientists, even anthropologists speak of hallucinogens, they boil down hallucinogens just to serotoninergic hallucinogens, i.e. Psychedelics. And so, for example, you have this review paper by Dave Nichols entitled Hallucinogens, and actually he speaks only of serotoninergic hallucinogens in this paper. And if you look at all the different categories or classes of hallucinogens available, there are plenty of them. So, cannabinoid hallucinogens are very well known. So kappa opioid hallucinogens, an example of this would be Salvia divinorum, right? Then nicotinic hallucinogens, tobacco, and you have a specific genus of tobacco with a lot of nicotine, which can induce strong hallucinations when smoked or taken in as a brew. Anticholinergic hallucinogens. So, for example, NMDA antagonists such as ketamine is an example of anticholinergic hallucinogens. Then you have other hallucinogens which are GABAergic hallucinogens. So, for example, Amanita muscaria, the mushroom, fly agaric mushroom, acts upon the GABA receptors. Then you have, so dopaminergic hallucinogens. So mainly it's, for example, when people take for a prolonged time amphetamines. Then after some amount of time, they start having plenty of hallucinations. And then you have psychedelics, so serotoninergic hallucinogens, tapping on serotoninergic receptors, and especially 1A and 2A, and anticholinergic hallucinogens, so such as datura, brugmansia, or synthetic compounds such as ditran. And then you have also hallucinogens which tap into several of these different receptors. So, for example, iboga has some action on nicotinic receptors, NMDA receptors, and also muscarinic receptors. So you have hybrid hallucinogens. So today I'm going to focus on a comparison between serotoninergic hallucinogens, i.e. Psychedelics, and anticholinergic hallucinogens, i.e. Deliriums. And I'm going to proceed this way. So first I'm going to introduce some of the main differences between serotoninergic and anticholinergic hallucinogens. Then I'm going to present influential models of hallucination, the monitoring models of hallucinations, and I'm going to criticize them. Then I'm going to talk about this notion of double bookkeeping, which has been developed about schizophrenia, and I'm going to argue that actually it doesn't work that well to characterize schizophrenia, but it works very well to characterize psychedelics. And then I'm going to talk about the sense of reality and showing that actually there are different kinds of the sense of reality, and trying to show how when people take serotoninergics or anticholinergics, some kinds are altered in specific ways. And finally, the last part would be very much anthropological. So I'm going to show how religious rituals, where there is some intake of serotoninergics or anticholinergics, are shaped by some fundamental neurobiological mechanisms. So the rituals are very different when you look at all the cultures using serotoninergics and anticholinergics. you are faced with very different rituals. Okay, so quickly, the differences between serotoninergics and anticholinergics. So here are examples of anticholinergic plants. So all of them are part of the nightshade family. So Datura, Bugmansia, Mandrake are very well known. This was used mainly among the ritual of Mexico, and belladonna was used mainly in European witchcraft in early modernity, henbane as well, and Duboisia by Aboriginal people in Australia. And here are examples of anticholinergic synthetic compounds, which have been actually extensively studied during the 70s by the American Army. They were studied for military purposes to be used as chemical weapons. And so many of the studies available on the effects of anticholinergics were actually done during that period. And the main compounds of all these anticholinergics are scopolamine, atropine, and iocyanine. And so there are some differences in the psychological effects of each of these compounds, and you can look at this paper if you are interested in looking at this. So I've been talking so far of anticholinergics, but to be more specific, there are two kinds of acetylcholine systems and acetylcholine receptors. So one class is nicotinic receptors, and the other class is muscarinic receptors. And when I'm speaking of anticholinergics, I'm specifically speaking of substances which have an antagonistic effect on muscarinic receptors, and they have no effect on nicotinic receptors. So if I was very specific, I would say anti-muscarinic hallucinogens. So here are examples of serotoninergic hallucinogens. So this is the Colorado river toad, which contains 5-MeO-DMT, which is smoked, psilocybin mushrooms, morning glory seeds, very similar to LSD, ayahuasca, which is quite well known. These two are similar to mescaline, and these two are snuffs, hallucinogenic snuffs, containing mainly DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, and bufotenine. And they have been extensively used in Amazonia for many thousands years, actually, in contradistinction to ayahuasca, which has been used only very recently. And then, of course, you have synthetic compounds, serotoninergic synthetic compounds. So mescaline and LSD are very well known. DMT, 4-HO-EMT is an example of a synthetic compound, which is an analog of psilocybin. And so mainly, all these serotoninergic hallucinogens, they tap into these two receptors. And there is this very interesting recent paper by Carl-Harris and Nutt, in which they show that each receptor underpins very specific cognitive and phenomenological effects. Okay, so what about the phenomenological differences between serotoninergics and anticholinergics? So Benny Shannon is an expert ayahuasca drinker, so he knows very well what the effect of serotoninergics are. And he also twice or three times, I don't remember exactly, tried, it wasn't planned, it was just serendipitous, but he tried twice or thrice Toei, which is Brugmansia, which is an anticholinergic. And so he describes in this quotation the difference between Toei, that is anticholinergic hallucinogen, and ayahuasca. So with Toei, the hallucination was completely incorporated within the perception of the external world around. I took the hallucination to be real and never suspected that it was not. With ayahuasca, on the other hand, so serotoninergic, this was never the case for me. With Toei, the anticholinergic, one does confuse the real and the non-real. With ayahuasca, one feels that one is presented with other realities, but these are not confused with the ordinary one. And this is another example from Reddit, which illustrates also this. So this person is responding to another person on the forum, and he says, "I'm sorry, but I honestly laughed for a good minute when you asked if Angel's trumpets, so an anticholinergic, were comparable to shrooms, psilocybin mushrooms. When you take an anticholinergic, it's not a trip at all. It's like constantly waking from a dream, only to wake up in another dream. There is no way to tell what is real or when it will end." So there is this notion that when you take serotoninergics, you are able to discriminate between what's the hallucination, what's ordinary reality, and you have this insight. You remember that you've taken a hallucinogen, as opposed to anticholinergics, where you totally forget that you've taken a hallucinogen, and there is no insight whatsoever. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce these very influential models of, monitoring models of hallucinations. So arguably one of the pioneers of this model was Marcia Johnson, the young psychologist Marcia Johnson. And so the basic idea of reality monitoring is that it refers to the processes by which a person attributes a memory to an external or internal source. So the question is, if I ask you about a specific memory that you have, and I ask you, did you acquire this memory through imagination, by imagining something or by perceiving something, then if you have a good reality monitoring and you have only imagined something, you will say, oh, this memory, I have only imagined it, okay? So I acquired it through imagination. And these are the memory I perceived it. And so some people who have a deficit of reality monitoring are not able to tease apart memories acquired through perception from memories acquired through imagination or dreaming or whatever you like. And so the idea is that memories have specific features that you can examine, and based on this, and this is often done in a subpersonal way, but based on this, you will tag this memory as being externally generated or internally generated, okay? So for example, a memory with, say, a great deal of visual and spatial detail and very little cognitive operations will be judged to have been externally derived. So if it's very rich, then you haven't made it up, right? So you really acquired it through perception. So that's the idea. And she says that there are two kinds of reality monitoring. One is like very personal and reflective, as opposed to another one which is based on subpersonal heuristics. And someone like Richard Bentel has further developed this model, showing that, there is a chapter in the book where he reviews all the studies presenting this. So showing that schizophrenic patients have real deficits in reality monitoring. So this framework, again, has been very influential. And so philosophers, psychologists, anthropologists have drawn upon it. But I think it has serious shortcomings. So first, for example, there is this recent paper which it seems to me provides a killing objection, which is that poor self-speech recognition turns out to be linked to acute psychosis in general and not specifically to hallucination. In other terms, Bentel was claiming that, he was saying, oh, look, psychotic patients have serious deficits of reality monitoring, okay? And this explains why they hallucinate. But actually, it turns out that deficit of reality monitoring predicts psychosis in general, and not only specifically hallucinating psychotic patients. So the point is not very convincing. And another problem is that when you are looking at auditory or visual hallucinations, you are interested in how people monitor reality online. Okay, so it's now how they monitor the information coming, as opposed to the reality monitoring model proposed by Marcia Johnson, which was offline, because it's about the memory that you have acquired in the past and not what's going on in the present moment. So we could try to say this model by resorting to a slightly different model, namely the self-monitoring model proposed by Chris Frith in this book. So basically, the idea is that so the point was trying to explain the experience of passivity when schizophrenic patients sometimes report that they have the impression that they are not the agent of the motor actions that they undertake. Okay, so for example, they move their hand and they feel that someone else has moved the hand, and they are not the author of the action. So there is no sense of agency for action, motor action. And so the model proposed by Frith is that when you undertake a motor action, there is an inference copy which is sent and which predicts what will be the result of the action. Okay, and then here you carry out the motor action, and then you have a comparator which compares the inference copy and the actual sensory feedback. And if there is a difference between the two, then it means that an external agent has interfered. But because there is some deficit, if you like, in these different operations in schizophrenic patients, they often have an inference copy which is different from the sensory feedback, and so they interpret the difference in terms of, oh, someone else is actually the author of my action. And so what should we think about this model? So the upside is that this model provides an explanation for online hallucinations, right? Because it's really it explains how tagging something as being generated by myself or by some external agent is being done online at the present moment. But the downside is that, indeed, there is a lot of evidence for this model as regards motor action, but there is not much experimental evidence to apply this model not only to motor action, but also to thinking and perceiving. Okay, and in his book, Chris Frith was proposing to extend the model, which was mainly targeting motor action to thinking and perceiving. But there is, it remains very speculative. And now Frith recognizes that it's probably not a good idea to apply it. It cannot be applied to thought and perception. And so these are very general shortcomings, I think, of these monitoring models. But if we come back to the distinction between serotoninergic and anticholinergic hallucinogens, the problem is that when these models try to explain the sense of reality, they distinguish between having a sense that something is real and having a sense that something is not real. And as I have started to show, when you are having a serotoninergic induced hallucination, so you know that it's not real in the sense that it's not ordinary reality, but as Shannon was saying, you nonetheless have the sense that it's real, but in a different sense than ordinary reality. So you need a third category, right? You cannot only do the job with the category of it's not real when there is an insight, and it's felt as being real when the person is taking the hallucination at face value. So you need a third category. And this leads me to the question of the topic of double bookkeeping. So the concept of double bookkeeping has been developed by a lawyer in the 19th century, but recently revived by Louis Sass and mainly and Sean Gallagher also. And the basic idea is that they kind of cherry pick cases of schizophrenic patients. But so they take some cases and they show that if you look at the illusions or hallucinations of these schizophrenic patients, very often they will say that they believe that something is the case. But when you look at how they behave, it's not consistent with what they believe. Okay? So for example, they say, oh, there is poison in all the food around, and they will be very happy to have a big dinner. So there is this inconsistency between the two. And so hence the notion of double bookkeeping. Okay, so the belief and the behavior are not evaluated or assessed in the same way. So some people have shown that actually double bookkeeping is not very representative of schizophrenic delusions and hallucinations. So there are some cases, admittedly, some cases where this is the case, but these are more like exceptions than the general rule. And also, for example, Bortolotti and Broom have proposed a very deflationary explanation of the mechanisms of what looks like double bookkeeping, but is not really double bookkeeping. And so I'm quite convinced by these different points that, for example, Bortolotti and Broom have made. But my suggestion is the following, is maybe indeed the concept of double bookkeeping doesn't apply that well to schizophrenia, to schizophrenic hallucinations and delusions, but it applies fairly well to psychedelic hallucinations. And so if we look at the definition that Sass, for example, gives of double bookkeeping, so he says what is suggested is something akin to Bloyer's double bookkeeping, where the patient experiences the delusional reality as existing in a different ontological domain from that of everyday reality. And here I want to report an anecdote of, so I did several interviews with people who have taken different hallucinogens. And this is a nice report which illustrates this very well, of a person who had drinking ayahuasca. And so basically the person had a vision of a jaguar suddenly coming out of the jungle. And the jaguar started to attack the person, right, who was on ayahuasca, and started to bite the person in such a way that the person would die very soon. And so the ayahuasca drinker, experiencing that, was like, oh, but I've taken ayahuasca, so it's just a vision, it's not real, so it doesn't matter. So on the one hand, the person was telling to himself this, but on the other hand, he was like, oh, I really need to do something, otherwise I'm going to die. And so there was this tension, right, this double bind. And so finally he realized that, oh, but this is a fantastical being. It's a hallucinatory being. So I have to use other weapons or tools to fight against it. And so he realized that it was through thinking that he would be able to fight the jaguar. And I think this case illustrates very nicely what double bookkeeping is all about. And so I think double bookkeeping can very fruitfully apply to psychedelic hallucinations and like schizophrenia. And what I want to suggest is that here you have single bookkeeping. So single bookkeeping is what you believe, how you behave, and everything is very consistent. And so when you take, for example, an anticholinergic, you take everything at face value. It's totally delusional. So here we have deliriums, anticholinergics. On the other hand, we have double bookkeeping, where you are very lucid, you have this insight, but still it feels very real. Okay. So and schizophrenia, depending, because schizophrenia is not a natural kind. There are different patients. It's in between, depending on in some cases it's very close to single bookkeeping, other cases very close to double bookkeeping. So if we want to further explore the differences between psychedelic experiences, delirium experiences, and schizophrenia, we can look, for example, at synchronicity and diachronicity of delusions. That is, so for example, if you hallucinate something while tripping on the delirium, you will take, so for example, let's say, when I see the door, I hallucinate the person, and I talk to the person for an hour. And then, it's often after 24 hours or 50 hours that the hallucination disappears. And then I realize that, I was hallucinating, and I don't believe in the hallucination anymore, okay? So this is what happens with delirium. On the other hand, with psychedelics, so when you have these visions, you are able to discriminate them from ordinary reality, but very often, people once the experience is over, they still think, well, I was accessing some truth. And so hence the notion of diachronicity of delusion, that is through time, what you are experiencing in the psychedelic experience is so compelling in some way that it's different from ordinary reality, but you still have the impression that you've accessed some underlying truth of the world. And so even after the end of the experience, you still ascribe some truth to what you, and so that the delusion remains somehow. And this is not the case with datura. So for example, in this quotation, it's very clear that once the hallucination is over, the person doesn't take it to be real anymore. Then discriminability. So as I have shown, with psychedelics, very easy to discriminate between what's the hallucination, what's ordinary reality. With delirium, the two are completely conflated, and schizophrenia is like in between. It depends on the cases. Then multiple or parallel realities. So as we've seen with psychedelics, you distinguish between this ordinary reality and then another like kind of parallel reality. While with deliriums, it's everything is conflated. So the hallucinatory world and the ordinary world. And then the diachronic corrigibility. So most of the beliefs that you acquire with psychedelics, even if you still believe in them after the experience, it's interesting to see that psychonauts, they often revise their beliefs about what so they have theories about what's the cosmos from what they've experienced on DMT or ayahuasca, but they revise very often, as they discover and experiment more with these drugs, they revise their models. So, there is a lot of corrigibility involved. And this is not the case with schizophrenia. And here I haven't I don't say anything about deliriums, because there is no diachronicity. That is, the delusions don't persist through time. Okay, so I still have 10 minutes, so I will go very quickly through this. So very often when cognitive scientists and psychiatrists and philosophers discuss the notion of the sense of reality, and for example, yesterday, Alexandre Billon or Jérôme de Kitsch, they assume that the sense of reality is a natural kind, and so there is one sense of reality. And this is nicely illustrated by this paper by Anil Seth and colleagues, and these two papers by Jérôme de Kitsch and Jean-Rémy Martin. And so in these papers, in these three papers, they build a theory of what the sense of reality is based on the study of different cases where the sense of reality is altered. And so there are several cases that are examined, but two of them are virtual reality and derealization. And so the basic claim, so here there is a problem with the slide, but so there should be, so here a check mark, okay, here a cross, here a check mark, and here a cross. And so basically the idea is they say, so we have one sense of reality, and if you are put in a virtual environment which works properly, then you will have the sense that the abyss that you see, so here there is an abyss, so the abyss is real, okay? So here there is a sense of reality. If you are in a bad a virtual environment, then you have no sense that the abyss is real. You know it's just nothing because the virtual environment is not working well. So you don't have a sense of reality. Here, when you are not derealized, that is, you know, everyone here is, I assume, not derealized. So we have a sense that things are real, while derealized patients, they report that the world is very distant, very dull, and so it's not real in some sense. And so one sense of reality, and which obtains in these two cases and doesn't obtain in these two other cases. And what I want to argue is that actually when they say that the sense of reality is lacking or is present, in the case of virtual reality and in the case of derealization, what they mean is actually very different if you look very precisely at the phenomenology of the experience and also the neurocognitive mechanisms. And so basically, the sense of reality that you have when you are in a virtual environment is mainly underpinned by sensory motor mechanisms. So if the virtual environment coordinate in the right way the different sensory inputs and makes you able to interact with things in the virtual environment, then you will have a sense that these things are real. But this is this is all about sensory motor mechanisms. Well, if we look at the lack of sense of reality in derealization, it's not because their sensory motor mechanisms are, impaired, but rather two mechanisms have been proposed. So one is, for example, that there is a limbic deficit and prefrontal hyperactivity. So basically, the world is not as affectively loaded as usual. And the other proposal is that there is a lack of subjectivity, that people don't feel that the world is devoid of mindness as it was before, and arguably because there is some impairment in the usual connectivity within the default mode network. So I will skip these. I've proposed that actually we should distinguish between several kinds of the sense of reality. So here I've sketched one, which is based on one kind of the sense of reality is based on sensory motor mechanisms. Another one is based on the activity in the limbic system, and another one is based on default mode network and sense of mindness. And studying, for example, lucid dreaming versus non-lucid dreaming, we can also show that prefrontal cortex areas, some areas, especially the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is very important to have to critically evaluate what you are living. And so basically, in lucid dreaming, the DLPFC is more activated than in non-lucid dreaming. And so when you see impossible things happening in dreaming, and you have the DLPFC, which is more activated than when you are having a non-lucid dream, then you are able to realize that actually you are dreaming, because this cannot really happen. And so if you distinguish between these different neurocognitive mechanisms, you end up having different kinds of the sense of reality, which are instantiated differently in the psychedelic experience and the delirium experience. But so I skip this, and I will finish with the last part, the more anthropological aspect of the distinction between serotoninergic and anticholinergic hallucinogens. So some authors, such as Weston Barr and Peter First, have proposed that actually, hallucinogens are the origins of religion. And what I want to argue here is that this is not very convincing, because there are many religions, actually, and religious systems in which there is no intake of hallucinogens whatsoever. So religions, of course, can exist without hallucinogens. But what I want to argue here is that hallucinogens do not generate religions, but they shape religions. So if you have a culture in which there is massive intake of serotoninergics and another culture in which there is massive intake of anticholinergics, then the two religious systems will be different. And so very quickly, I want to say a few words about this theory of ritual, which has been proposed by Harvey Whitehouse. And so basically, it distinguishes between two kinds of religion, and which correspond to two kinds of rituals. So in one kind of religion, so imagine what he calls imagistic religion, the ritual that you do them not very often, but when you do them, it's very intense, okay? So high arousal, and it's very harsh. So think of initiatory rituals. And it taps very much into episodic memory. So you have very strong and intense experiences, and so you encode this in your episodic memory very efficiently, and I skip the other characteristics. And as opposed to doctrinal religion, so think of going every Sunday to the mass. So this has high frequency, but it's very boring. So you are just repeating the same. There is nothing very. It's not high arousal, except if you are looking at more evangelical and charismatic, of course, Christianity. And it's mainly, it taps mainly into semantic memory. So it's all about learning that God is 3 and 1, and as opposed to encoding episodic memory. Okay, but this model has been criticized by Dimitris Xaigalatas, and he has studied this ritual in Spain, showing that actually in this specific firewalking ritual, so there is some, it's a high arousal ritual because people are walking on fire. And so they've combined subjective report and also filmed the ritual, okay, with cameras, and then comparing what people were saying about what they experienced during the ritual and what actually happened. And they showed that people are just describing very, very poorly what really happened. And this contradicts Whitehouse proposal, because he says encoding in episodic memory is very efficient when there is high arousal, and so this is high arousal. So you would expect people to remember extremely well what's actually happening in the ritual, and this is not the case. And so this has been further developed by Fortier, and the general idea is that in all these religious rituals, and especially involving high arousal, all the point is to generate impairment in critical executive and control functions, so that people don't have won't be very critical about the ideas or the dogmas that you will teach them. Okay, so that's the general idea. And what I want to suggest is that if you look at rituals involving anticholinergic intake and serotoninergic intake, you can adjudicate this controversy between Fortier and Harvey Whitehouse in an interesting way. So one crucial thing is that anticholinergics are very well known for triggering amnesia. Okay, so people don't remember much of the experience when they take anticholinergics, as opposed to serotoninergics. And so, for example, in this paper, they show that episodic memory is somewhat potentiated by ayahuasca. Okay, so this is very interesting because we have two rituals. In both cases, it's high arousal because there is some hallucinogenic intake. But in one case, there is very good encoding. So when you take serotoninergics, in the other case, there is no encoding of what's happening. And so it kind of contradict both White House theory and Schott theory. And so if you compare the different areas, cultures in the world where there was, so includes, massive intake of serotoninergics. So in Mesoamerica, so mushrooms, peyote, different also DMT, pyremio DMT snuffs and toad venoms. And so here you have a lot of serotoninergic intake. In Amazonia also, a lot of serotoninergic intake. Then you have all these Californian and Southwest American tribes, which were taking a lot of datura. And in Amazonia, it was brugmansia, but still anticholinergic. And here the Aboriginal people from Australia, they were using the huasca, which is an anticholinergic. So if you compare all these different rituals, so anticholinergic-based rituals and serotoninergic-based rituals, you can notice that, what about frequency? Well, when people take serotoninergics, they do the ritual very, very often, okay? So they do the snuff, DMT snuff, like once a week, or ayahuasca once a week. So high frequency, as opposed to anticholinergic-based rituals, which were done a few times a lifetime, okay? So there is a difference about sensoriality. So if you look at the ritual, serotoninergic-based rituals, there is a lot of music, songs involved, interactions with other people, because of course there is all this synesthetic, there is a lot of synesthesia, a lot of, like, you have the feeling that there is telepathic communication with other people. So the environment matters to a large extent with serotoninergic. It's not the case with anticholinergics, and as a consequence, we can observe that sensoriality is very, very, it's not rich in the anticholinergic-based rituals. So richness of the content. In anticholinergic ritual, it's mostly like vision quests, and so you receive a message from a spirit, and that's all, as opposed to serotoninergic-based rituals when you learn, a lot of information from the experience. And this is not surprising because, again, anticholinergics, they trigger amnesia. And also number of participants. So typically in serotoninergic ritual, the shaman takes himself the serotoninergic drug, as opposed to anticholinergic rituals in which you have one person or a few people taking the anticholinergic drug, and then the trip sitter is just observing and assisting, but without taking any. And so if we sum up, we have all these differences between the two categories. And so as you can see, there are basic neurobiological properties of each class, and these translate into different features of the rituals. So culture is shaped by neurobiology. And so to conclude, I just want to say that I think we should, I want to argue against monolithic approaches to hallucinations and hallucinogenic experiences. So we should not consider that, hallucination is a natural kind, and there is one type of hallucinogen, very different kinds of experiences. And I think that if we make all these distinctions, it can be very fruitful for, questions in philosophy, psychology, anthropology, neuroscience. And thank you.
Any questions?
Sure. A very quick question or comment. It's fantastic, by the way. Thanks so much. It's cleared up a lot. I think maybe in the end, there's one. Could we add one more descriptive name, namely, and the reason for the change in culture, the frequency of use, is I think the danger of these plants, right?
Yeah.
Because the anticholinergic are very easy to overdose and as death results.
Yeah.
And think it's probably a reason why.
And it's very tough. People, when they do it, they don't want to take it again. And no, I agree. And the dose you have to take to have hallucinogenic effect is very close to the dose which will kill you, as opposed to psychedelics. I mean, you can take 20 times the regular dose and you won't die. So
yeah.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Yes, Martin, I was wondering, like, the analysis you gave, is there a possibility to do that in a data-driven fashion?
Yeah, so there are two, I'm doing two, so I haven't presented because it's ongoing work. But so on the one hand, we are using algorithms. So we look at databases such as Aeroid, and also I've built a database from Reddit, and then with algorithm you look at the terms which are recurrent for each family. And so this is ongoing work, and so there are differences between the two. And then also there are the human files, which is a huge database of anthropological data, and I haven't started this yet, but the idea is to do big data with the human files and see whether what I'm proposing here is confirmed.
I'm going to present stuff on a questionnaire that is super nice.
Oh, okay, yeah.
For stratification of rituals.
I got a question.
Sure. Thank you, little sharp as usual. I just have a couple of comments actually to side thing that you said. So one is on the sense of reality. I couldn't really understand why you wanted to present sense of reality as broken down in different kinds. Because to me, it makes more sense if the sense of reality is just one feature of a cognitive system that is like very high level, very has a complex structure. So what you can break down is maybe some more basic properties that build up the sense of reality rather than the sense of reality itself.
So if you accept that in lucid dreaming you have no sense of reality, and in non-lucid dreaming you have a sense of reality, that in derealization you have no sense of reality, and in non-derealization you have a sense of reality. So if you accept these cases as being a sense of lack of sense of reality and presence of sense of reality, then as a consequence you have to accept that there are different kinds of the sense of reality, because the neurocognitive mechanisms underlying each sense of reality is very different. So there is no way to unify the two. Now you can say, oh no, it doesn't make any sense to have different kinds of the sense of reality. And so you will be led to reject that, for example, in non-lucid dreaming, it's a genuine case of the lack of sense of reality. But so in either way, it's very problematic. So I would just bite the bullet and say that all these cases are intuitively it makes sense to say that there is sense of reality, lack of sense of reality in derealization, virtual reality, lucid dreaming, non-lucid dreaming, etc. But as a consequence, there are different kinds of the sense of reality.
So based on neuroscientific data.
Yeah, because in one case it's the DLPFC which explains why there is no sense of reality. In the other case, it's the sensory, motor contingencies. In the other cases, like the activation of the amygdala, and so.
Okay, and the second one is more curiosity. At some point you said, and you reference to Lavar first, that hallucinogens are not in the origin of religion, and you said that they're definitely not because there's a lot of evidence. And what is the evidence for the origin of religion? Because it's a really
there are different stories. I mean, so for example, I have a paper in which I argue that actually just by probabilistic reasoning, you can come up with supernatural ideas. So I would even go as far as against people like Tanya Luhrmann or Antace, who say that you need anomalous experiences or special experiences to form supernatural beliefs. I think just by doing just probabilistic reasoning, you can come up with, and it would take me 5 minutes to explain this. But
Okay, so I'm asking this because it feels to me that hallucinogens might be a better way to explain the appearance of religious thinking if you think of a continuity across species of the use of hallucinogens. So there are other animals that do not have religious systems, as far as we know, that consume hallucinogens.
Mhm.
And therefore, it seems that in our evolutionary history, our ancestors might have started to take hallucinogens and incorporate them in their diet or daily practices before the appearance of religious systems. Therefore, taking them as a possible basis for religious thinking is much more appropriate than, for example, a statistical behavior. Statistical inference or inferential behavior in general, because that's something that was developed later on.
I mean, it's very controversial, when did religion appear, and then, but yeah, I agree. No, I agree.
But if I may, like, that hypothesis, like we don't consider it, but it's more like an approach because like it's not just the economical way of explaining things, but like, and there's a lot of territories in which like, there is not.
Like,
molecules.
Oceania.
They are not used, and so if you want to base like the whole religious phenomenon on that use of science, like give like such an extent to the diffusionists.
Yes,
That's not it's
yeah.
economical data hypothesis, for instance, to say that
But how does it fit with evolution across species? Like the fact that other species use hallucinogens and they incorporate them in their practice, in their diet. It seems that they
are not religious. Or,
yeah, well,
they're not
religious.
religious, so I don't know.
Thanks.
You know that I feel that I like your work and I feel like really interesting. But I don't know, it's like maybe the second or third time that I listen to you talk on that anticholinergic and more I'm doubtful about it. So I mean like it's clearly interesting, but I'm sure that you're fully on kind of pharmacological reductionism.
Not at all.
And I don't know, when I was seeing your map, for instance, your map about the anticholinergic and serotoninergic and your criteria, come on, it's a bit like, don't you see that it's a bit rough category, like saying like, there is never, serotoninergic are always used like that, or serotoninergic never.
I mean, show me data which is confirm what I'm saying.
Okay,
so, but
even like just on the different areas that I know in the organism, for instance, like anti-serotoninergic are super frequently mixed with anticholinergic.
Well, precisely. Let's look, for example,
what you call ayahuasca, sometimes or frequently there is toy inside.
That's traditionally most of the mixtures do not involve toy. Now you are right in saying that there is, as I was showing in the map. So in Amazonia there is the tradition of anticholinergic intake. But if you look at the rituals, for example, the Jivaros, they have these rituals for anticholinergic and serotoninergic, and the rituals look very different. So
but you use the Jivaro example because it's one of the clearer cultural settings in which they are separating the use of anticholinergic and serotoninergic. It's really two different cultural settings. But I was just wanting to stress to you, maybe to complexify your model, the fact that there's a lot of practices as like Peruvian shamanism, in which they are mixing both substances, and it's not necessarily like affecting the way of using. And there is like, for instance, and on the other point, like maybe that I wanted to stress to you, is like the fact that sometimes, for instance, there is like use of anti-serotoninergic as an ayahuasca, more like as a daily practice without such complexified ritual setting. So I'm not really convinced by the fact that there is like such like clear categories of use for like each pharmacological category. I'm afraid that it's a bit maybe a cultural ethnocentric projection for your part from your pharmacological point of view
So I would say two things. So one is I'm claiming that I haven't talked about it, but it's a cultural attractor. So I'm not saying that 100% of rituals based on anticholinergics will be as described, and 100%. I say it's a cultural attractor. So basically, we'll have 80% of serotonin. So if you find 20% of counterexamples, that's not a problem for my claim. Now, if you find that in 50% of the cases, so that basically there is no difference between, oh, here you have a good objection, but you have to show me that in all these cases, and looking at the human files, in 50% of the cases, you have. So the claim is that it's like 80 or 90, 80-20 or 90-10, and if you show me that it's otherwise, then I'd be convinced.
Okay, good. And what do you answer about the mixing practices, the practice of mixing anticholinergic?
I mean, the only example that, they're like mestizo shamanism, and when they put Toei in the ayahuasca beverage, this is very recent. So you don't have, I'm talking about a cultural evolution. So the scale is like hundreds of years. And the use of mestizo shamanism is very, very recent. So you cannot use that. What's nice, for example, with
As far as we can.
Californian rituals, based on Datura, is that, during hundreds of years, they've been doing this. And the serotoninergic snuffs in Amazonia for hundreds of years. Dubois in Australia, the same. So here are good examples.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Martin. So yeah, you were saying that the relationship between the kind of drug and the kind of reduced ideas was probability because it's constrained by drugs operate as social attractors. Could you specify the kind of mechanisms of cultural transmission that can indeed constrain the reduced contents and give examples of the kind of reduced representation that are more likely to occur in each category?
So here I haven't been talking about the representations themselves. I've been talking about the form of the ritual in general. But, there is, I think, a lot of evidence for this claim. And there is another claim I've made this hypothesis, and for example, at the seminar last year, that also these two classes might determine different representations. So, for example, with anticholinergics, there is only one world, everything is conflated, as opposed to serotoninergics, there is the ordinary world and then this supernatural world. And so this should favor kind of, a very general metaphysical dualism, but this is very hypothetical, and I need to do more work with the human files, the anthropological historical database to see. I'm not sure that. I think, at least now, with what I've read, that the shapes of the rituals are clearly determined by the type of compound involved. I wouldn't say so with it's very hypothetical, very speculative about the content of the representation.
Because last year you were committed to giving examples.
Yeah.
Both categories.
Yeah. So I have examples to support the claim that the content is determined by the compound, but these are just like cherry-picked example, and if you look at it from a general, using a database, I'm not. It might be the case, but I need to do more research on this. So I suggest that Guillaume will talk now, and then we will have a general discussion and while drinking and. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Just a question about. I thought you agreed with the diversifications of the senses of reality, but how do you conceive of hierarchical processes? For example, when you make the example about the jaguar, it is clear that there's the sense of the jaguar coming, and there is the belief that I took a drug, and so it is in the experience of the drug, it's made by the drug. It is like similar to a semi-fictional, in a sense, to a semi-fictional state. So So in this case, I tend to think that there is a sort of subordination of one sense of reality with respect to the other, because one has two different levels of reality, but one acts or doesn't act according to one, giving more importance to one with respect to the other. So I would like you to elaborate a little more about what are the criteria of hierarchical configurations between different senses of reality. Are there always hierarchical constructs, or there are different ways in which they can be articulated one with the other?
I would argue they are all at the same level. And so for example, in the case of the Jaguar, I mean, the speculative interpretation of this specific case would be that because the DLPFC is not, really deactivated on serotoninergic hallucinogens, you have this critical sense as to what's happening. So you don't take everything at face value. So you know that you've taken a hallucinogen and so on and so forth. So that's why you are able to discriminate, and you say, oh, it's just a hallucination, okay? Because the DLPFC is normally functioning. On the other hand, so for example, Riba has shown that the amygdala is hyperactivated, and so when you imagine things, the claim would be that usually the amygdala, when it's just imagination, is not too activated, and in this case, it's hyperactivated. So effectively, what you are hallucinating feels very real. So if you compare this DLPFC component and the amygdala component, I would say they are exactly at the same level. Now there is another question, which is, what's my belief about the nature of these experiences? So if I'm a supernaturalist person and I believe that the supernatural world is real, then I will have the belief that, okay, this Jaguar is real, but it's not real in the same sense as the table is real. So I will distinguish between ordinary objects and supernatural objects, and both are real. So this is like a high-level belief. If I'm a naturalist person, I will say, okay, there is the hallucinatory world, the ordinary world, and actually the hallucinatory world is not real. But again, when we are talking about this level, the belief, am I a supernaturalist or naturalist? We are talking about the judgments of reality and not the sense of reality. And so I would say that at the non-reflective level, the DLPFC, the amygdala, the sensory motor contingencies, and so on and so forth, are all different kinds of reality and all are at the same level. And then you have judgments of reality. And you can have a sense that something is real and judge it as being non-real. And conversely, you can have a sense that it's non-real and judge it as being real. But so there is no hierarchy in what I'm proposing, because at the sense of reality level, everything is.
And so you don't think that there is cognitive penetrability from judgment to experience?
Well, there might be. I mean, I haven't discussed this. There might be some, but. Well, I mean, when I'm proposing this heterogeneous theory of the sense of reality, I'm not discussing these questions. But then, I mean, so your question is, okay, so now that you have the judgment of reality level and the sense of reality level, how the two, interact exactly?
Yes.
That's
like
another,
the infrastructures of mind,
Yeah.
I don't know, but the way we conceive of mind change and can affect.
Yeah, I must say, I mean, so if the way to conceive of the relationship between the two is Tanya's proposal, then I wouldn't be convinced. Because
For
I have,
example,
yeah.
how do you
But that would be,
conceive between
yeah.
both?
Yeah.
Thank you. With the
Yeah.
now?
Do you want? I think maybe Guillaume should present now, and then we have a general discussion. And at the same time, the coffee break. So we talk while eating and.
Okay.